Dr. Bruno. Thank you. So welcome all of you who were able to join us on time tonight. This is a webinar in the series of Eurasian environments. And today with us, we have Dr. Andy Bruno, who is an environmental historian of Russia and the Soviet Union, and whose work explores the complex relationships between people and the natural world. His research highlights the relevance of environmental perspectives to major themes in Russian and Eurasian history, from energy and labor to revolution and reindeer. Dr. Bruno is the author of two books, and today's presentation is going to be in reference to one of his books about the 1908 Tunguska explosion. So join me in welcoming Dr. Bruno, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. So I wanted to, first off, I'm very happy to be here. Thank you for inviting me, all of that. My understanding is that this group has been sort of attending a series of webinars on Eurasian environments. And so, as it happens, I taught my first session of a graduate class on Eurasian environmental history last night. So I thought I'd start before getting into Tunguska with just briefly showing you what we're planning on doing this semester to kind of give you a sense of where my thinking is about where this field is. I know that Nicholas Brayfogle gave you an introduction, and Kelly O'Neill delved deeper into the imperial period, and Sarah Cameron has looked at the RLC with you all. But this is sort of what kind of where I'm thinking, and then I'll switch over to the presentation. Okay, so this is just sharing the schedule of our syllabus, not all of that. But so we started yesterday talking about Central Eurasia, Russia, Eurasia, and Eastern Europe, sort of a very broad thing. Eurasian a definition of Eurasia that actually includes South Asia as well as Eastern Europe, so beyond the sort of post-Soviet space. We'll be turning to looking at several sort of books, things like David Moon's book on the steppe in and the transformation of the Russian grasslands, looking at the borderlands of the Qing Empire, and with an environmental history by Jonathan Schlesinger, looking at what becomes Bulgaria with this new book about water in Sofia in the Ottoman period, including looking at another thing. We have a student who does Indian history, so I also wanted to include India on there, about looking at Calcutta and water. Finally, in the sort of part of this course that is looking at questions of empire and pre-revolutionary period, looking at Central Asia with Maya Peterson, pipe dreams about Central Asia, as well as some newer work by two scholars, Anna Mazanik and Jennifer Keating, who have done really interesting work on the environmental history of late imperial Russia, both in Central Asia and more in the heartland of Moscow. Then we turn to the state socialist period, look at Stephen Brain's book on Soviet forestry, which was the sort of revisionist account that sort of emphasized the robustness of Stalinist forest protection, turning to energy and communist China and non-communist Japan, with Victor Seo's carbon technocracy. Look at East Germany and animal history, with this book called Communist Pigs, about East Germany's uh, agricultural industry. Turn then to Soviet whaling, with this book by Ryan Tucker Jones, Red Leviathan, which also I pair with a piece by Bathsheba Demuth. Instead of reading her whole book, many of these students read her book last semester, so I didn't want to do that. And then we turn to Elena Kochetkovan's recent work on the green power of socialism, that sort of also kind of continues this somewhat revisionist line about seeing the places that the Soviet Union struggled to actually be more environmental, even if it failed in many ways. Um, And I pair that with a couple pieces, including by a work by Kate Brown, who's a very important scholar of nuclear stuff in the Soviet Union, and Katya Bruch, who's just wrote a whole book about Russian peat as an energy source, trying to recast fossil fuel history. And then we end with looking at post-Soviet, post-socialist legacy, ecological legacies, looking at Romania and the question of land reform from an environmental angle. And then we finish with this recent book about ecocide in Ukraine that's responding to the war over the past few years and going back further as also a way to sort of reflect on this question of what is ecocide and how does it fit into historical narratives. Um, okay. So I will briefly see if anyone wanted to ask any questions about that or had any comments. I assume some of that sounds familiar, but some of it not. Um, that's sort of where, when I had to put together a whole reading list for graduate students, that's where my head went.
Thank you so much. It looks so wonderful. I had just a question. If are you able to share the list with me to share it just with the fellows in case they want to look to some of these resources to use for their lesson plan building?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I'd
Okay.
rather not go on the website for some reasons, but I'm very happy to send you that for the
Yeah,
detail.
and it's going to be shared only in our private Basecamp group. So we won't
Perfect.
post it on the website and we can say it. And when I post it, I will say that we won't share it. Nobody should share it.
It's not a big deal. It's just
It's not, but still,
recently our universities are forcing us to put our syllabi online, and so there's a little bit of like, well, okay, I don't
it's
want
your
you forced to do
design.
it.
We want to
Yes.
keep it yours for sure. Thank you
Yeah.
so much. This is
Yeah.
wonderful. I don't know if anybody else had questions.
All right. Well, we can come back to that too if anyone is so desirous later on. But now I'll get into the Tunguska event. So let me share that. Okay. All right. And that's all visible to everyone? All right. Wonderful. So um, I gave you a brief thing that actually opens up the book that I wrote about to the Tunguska event. It's a blog post that actually begins how I begin the book itself. Um, and the Tunguska, just very quickly, of course, the Tunguska event was this explosion that occurs in 1908 in a desolate part of Siberia that um, fells this huge landscape of trees. It most likely was thought of as a meteor at the time, but when investigators went to look at it, they didn't find they found neither a crater nor a big chunk of metal, which is what they expected. And then it becomes this big mystery. And it intrigued me not as for the mystery itself exactly, but for what we might gain about understanding the environmental history of the Soviet Union, of Russia, by foregrounding mystery itself. And as I said it in the beginning of the book in the piece you read, I do that in part by actually trying to get you in that headspace. What would you think if you were in the middle of Siberia and all of a sudden you see this forest with all these trees extended out, or prostrate on the ground, and were curious about what possibly could have caused such destruction so far from any logging works or anything like that. Um, and then I introduce this idea that sort of drives the larger analysis of my study, which is that it helps us to think about the Tunguska site as a landscape of mystery. That this event is helpful for revealing the potency of mystery in human engagements with the natural world. And I mean mystery in sort of two main senses. I mean mystery as something that comes from the natural world itself. So the fact that we do not actually understand everything about the non-human surroundings is a sort of perennial, ineffable part of human experience. We think we might know more and more about particular things. Our knowledge might increase on various topics, but there always remains this part that is not understood, is mysterious. Um, the other part is the more cultural process, the way that human societies come to determine and decide what is a mystery itself. It's also it's not, if no one wonders about it, is it a mystery? Well, that's a question, right? And in some ways, I'm saying it has to be both something that's not understood and something that humans decide through their own cultural, social processes is a mystery. Um, and so this idea, of course, how that those cultural processes can be both something where you have a mystic who might intuit the meaning of a mystery, in a more sort of religious sense, where you also have the sort of culture of the detective or the criminal investigator who's trying to solve a case, right? In terms of this event, and I'm going to go through this event, sort of following the arc of the book itself, which was composed to be kind of a narrative arc. So I'll kind of go through and lay it out. A lot of this will become more clear as I go through it. But these are the sort of three of the themes that are really important for understanding mystery's role in the history of the Tunguska explosion. One is that mystery solving shaped the treatment of the landscape. And this is probably the most sort of distinctive element because we're used to thinking about the ways that landscapes are transformed and changed over time from a various processes, agriculture, industry, militarization, settlement, deforestation, conservation, these types of processes. And one of the things I try to point out here is that this is landscape for most of the 20th century is the process that's most important for shaping how it's treated is this effort to treat it as kind of a crime scene, a place for solving a mystery. Another thing is that the mysterious nature of what caused this events historically um, allowed for the involvement of unofficial actors and alternative knowledge. Um, People who were on the fringes of science, sometimes even science fiction writers, end up playing a voluntary expedition members end up playing an important role in creating knowledge about it. And then finally is the enigmatic complexity of cosmic disasters themselves. The fact that we live in this vast universe, and we don't necessarily understand and didn't, and even in the beginning of the 20th century, understood much less what risks are out there, and what possibly we might encounter in terms of uh, unknown disasters. Um, all of that's sort of to say that I put this sort of larger idea of mystery at the center of the narrative. But I also, that kind of is pretty broad in some ways. And this is also very much a place-based history. So I center Siberia and Soviet history in ways that sort of stress the place itself. And this is important for me in doing this book because there is actually a quite wide ranging sort of amateur astronomer literature out there about this event that doesn't even engage with the Russian language materials at all, frankly. That doesn't really that thinks of this more sort of purely from the perspective of international science. And I thought it was really important to highlight the place. Um, and this allows me to sort of weigh in on a few things about Soviet history, more from a cultural and social history lens, in the project. So I find that there was a really interesting mixing of the revolutionary and the religious, the scientific and the supernatural. These are sometimes seen as sort of opposite things, the sort of secular revolutionaries versus the sort of traditionalist religious culture of Russia. And what we actually see is a lot of mixing in a lot of ways that these sort of ideas come together in various amalgams throughout the Soviet Union. We also see the ways that individuality and creativity merge together, and collectivity merge together in distinctive ways, right? That this isn't sort of this vast conformity, nor is it a liberal individualism. There's a sort of distinctive relationship between how people who were involved in trying to investigate Tunguska merged. balanced individuality and collectivity. I also think that we see very interesting environmental subjectivities of many of the actors, so ways that they developed affective bonds with the natural surroundings and Siberia in particular. And finally, this is this sort of micro history of the expeditions that come to try to understand this Tunguska event, the Tunguska explosion, allow us to see some of the fluidity about and oppressiveness around hierarchies of gender, class, and ethnicity in the Soviet Union in quite interesting ways. Okay, so those are my sort of big ideas. Now I want to go through and sort of talk through the story of this event and then how it's investigated. So on a June morning, June 30th, June 17th in Russia's calendar at the time, but June 30th on our calendar, 1908, there's this massive explosion in the sky. Um, Witnesses see it for um, hundreds of miles away. It occurs in a very remote part of Siberia. The people who are most close to it are indigenous Evenki, but traders and other people and peasants in a much wider area of Siberia see this in the sky in the morning. Um, in the epicenter itself, where the blast occurs in this Tunguska site, you have a whole collection of testimony that is later collected that describes seeing a large explosion in the sky, feeling like they're being knocked over. I have this quotation from this one Evenki woman, Akulina, whose husband Ivan most likely dies in this event. And she describes the awful marvel, how the changed the forest immediately, how there was this large territory burning, as well as the sort of pain that Ivan had after he woke up and had a bloody broken arm and kept crying and cursing until they left him. I'm not sure how visible it is for all of you, but the yellow and green dots and the red dots all are places. The red dot is about where the epicenter is estimated to be, and those dots are where Evenki were camping out near the site. So just, it's a fairly desolate place, but there were people still in the relative vicinity of the explosion. Not many. So in the immediate after that, then you have a couple hundred witnesses, and you have people who get hurt, including Ivan, and others, people who feel this bright heat, people who have limbs get hurt, get smashed, people who seem to have suffered from concussions. You also get rumors and panic that go around. Rumors such as this was the Japanese invading. This is 1908. It's not that long after the Russo-Japanese War. Ideas that this was God's vengeance for the 1905 revolution. Um, and, in the case of someone like Akulina's husband, Ivan, possibly death, which is important to point out because this often been discussed that this was this massive explosion, several Hiroshima bombs worth of force, and no one died, right? But that's actually not true. We've now been able to sort of deduce that there was. There was also environmental damage, dead reindeer, frightened animals, various testimonies of things happened, and of course the destroyed forest. Later studies reveal certain ecological effects of the explosion. Um, and all of that's to say that this was clearly a disaster, right? And that's important to point out because in social scientific literatures about disasters, we sometimes, distinguish between a hazard and a disaster. And a disaster has to harm something, right? A hazard is just what it is, right? Like a hurricane that just goes into the Atlantic Ocean and doesn't do any damage isn't called a disaster. A hurricane that destroys Miami would be called a disaster. And here I think we have the case from the injuries and death that this was a disaster, but it also, of course, could have been much more severe had the cause of this explosion hit somewhere else. And but the interesting thing about that is that we then see that there is ways that certain things that social factors that we can understand for understand that come into play for understanding how human vulnerabilities have been produced mattered even in the case of this explosion, even the case of a cosmic disaster. So the fact that this was desolate had to do some in part with uh, the ways that Evenki were dealing with the Russian state and tax collection at the time, as well as internal dynamics amongst different reindeer herders and social feuds amongst themselves. Now, in terms of the press, I just wanted to quickly show that as early as a few weeks after the event, um, there was already coverage of this in regional newspapers. So this is from the Voice of Tomsk talking about, yet again, we're talking about the meteor that fell in Siberia, right? Um, it goes away. It's the understanding of what happened here quickly kind of gets lost to history. But at the time, it was already sort of thought, oh, this must be a meteorite. Okay, so what then happens though is that, well, something, of course, big happens in Russia between 1908 and the 1920s, right? World War I, the Russian Revolution, the rise of the Bolsheviks to power. And in all this period, Tunguska has kind of become a forgotten event. It was the explosion was big enough to have decimated Manhattan if it had hit there. But because it was so remote, it made, it gets some notice in the newspaper, even internationally. There's like, oh, there was some bright nights over Siberia in Europe that were connected to this explosion, but it was kind of forgotten until the early 1920s. And what happens is that you have this extremely difficult to access terrain for outsiders is met with this intrepid individual named Leonid Kulik, who learns about this, you know, supposed massive meteorite explosion from 1908 and makes it his sort of life mission to go out and try to find evidence of this. Um, and his persistence is a remarkable part of the story because, as people, some of his contemporaries have said, you know, no one else would have tried to arrange these searches in the way that he did at the time, which might not be true that no one, but it took his own persistence. He, and in doing this, it's at first it's important to sort of emphasize how um powerful the natural world was in this story because they just didn't have roads, they didn't have means to get there. The Venki, the locals had a sense of how to get to the site, but they also did not necessarily want to help Russian scientists who they thought might be interested in geological prospecting and other types of things. So Kulik first tries to get to the site in 1921, and he doesn't even get close. He gets to Kansk, which is nowhere near the Tunguska site. Um, he's then finally able to arrange an expedition in 1927 that allows him to uh, get to see the site for the first time and record his impressions, understand that there's this massive forest fall. And he assumes that there must be a crater there and it must be a meteorite there. And I should point out, he only gets to the site by relying on Evenki guides, who have the knowledge about where it is and contribute to Soviet science in some ways by being assistants to him, even if Kulik himself ends up having a pretty prickly personality and doesn't always appreciate um, the help of the Evenki and sometimes tries to use subterfuge with them. But they were essential for him getting there. He arranges then an expedition to come back in 1928 with a film crew, with a much more supplies, um, and a small group of expeditionary workers. At this point is when they start, like, they actually get to sort of the center of the site. They start talking about it as a sort of land of the dead forest, this eerie landscape where animals no longer roamed. Um, and a bunch of the people who were at the site become very ill with what seems to be, for some of them, seems to be scurvy in terms of the effects that they had. And they evacuate. They leave Kulik by himself in the forest because he wants to continue to search for the meteorite. And, you know, from a variety of reasons, one of the people who gets back to the capitals, back to Leningrad, sounds the alarm about, hey, we have this scientist who's looking for the Tunguska meteorite out in the middle of the taiga, and he's in danger. And we need to send a rescue mission to him with all sorts of additional resources. And becomes an international sensation. This is all throughout the Soviet newspapers. Becomes an international, reported internationally. And it's when the idea that, oh, wait, there's this guy out in the taiga looking for a meteorite and he hasn't found it. It's when it becomes a mystery. And it starts to be reported that. And, Kulik himself starts writing poetry about where are we going to find this mysterious meteorite. Um, he doesn't end there though, right? He comes back, he barely makes it back alive, right? He has to go to the hospital when he gets back. Even though he insisted when they found him that we have to continue doing this work, he's extraordinarily exhausted. But then he immediately arranges, while the sort of public sentiment is on his side, for another long-term expedition in 1929 and 1930. Um, and at this point, this is where the various means of mystery solving really come into play. They do everything they possibly can. They scour for magnetic items because they think that there's going to be a big iron meteorite. They conduct geodesic analysis. They get eyewitness testimony from everyone they could think of. They start to plan an aerial survey. They collect samples, including in the mouths of birds, to see if possibly some sort of magnetic fragment of a meteorite might be there. And then they also drill and drill into wetlands and drain them, thinking that these might be meteorite craters. Um, this work is hard, and it leads to all sorts of drama in the midst of these expeditions. Kulik hires several sort of local Siberian workers to assist him and brings along several scientists, including a young Yevgeny Klinov. Um, and some of the workers, after being sick of having to drill into these uh, frozen deep divots and seeing nothing at the bottom but a tree stump, which means it couldn't have been caused by a meteorite. These are the places that they dig and try to find the crater end up not being meteorite craters. They denounce him to authorities. They're Communist Party members and they denounce him to authorities. One of them even carves a poem into a tree at the Tunguska site, talking about how Kulik will leave the taiga in shame for wasting all their time and energy. Um, so this long-term expedition ends up a failure, right? They don't find a meteorite, which of course deepens the mystery of what possibly could have caused this massive explosion over Siberia. The work kind of becomes mothballed until the late 30s, where then they finally are able to conduct an aerial survey of the site that shows that the somewhat of the extent of the forest fall. Um, they have a few smaller expeditions, and then they're planning a big expedition in 1941, in the summer of 1941, which of course doesn't happen because World War II in the Soviet Union breaks out. And Kulik, who's in his 50s at the time, immediately enlists and is captured as a POW and dies in a POW camp in 42. Um, so ends the sort of first part of the story, or the second part of the story, the Kulik expeditions part of the story. what really kind of changes the trajectory from sort of deep research, arduous research at a site and a deepening mystery of what could cause the Tunguska explosion to um, a fodder for all sorts of fantastic explanations and hypotheses is the contributions of fiction writers in the aftermath of World War II. Now, the context here is, of course, really, and fiction itself becomes a new mystery solving technique. Now, the context here is really important. This is right, it's right after the explosions in Hiroshima and Nagasaki in Japan. Um, the space age, which is will come in the 1950s, is important, but because there's already sort of excitement about some of the possibilities. The Cold War with the United States very much affects some of the ways that fiction plays a role in this. Um, the international influence in UFOs. This is right around the same time as there's a flying saucer seen in Washington State, and then the Roswell hubbubaloo in New Mexico. And also importantly for the Soviet context, and is that this is the first generation sort of after the war where you have mass literacy, mass scientific education, and interest in all in popular science very broadly. And it sort of might seem uh, 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 paradoxical uh, that increased mass education, increased science education leads to fantastic theories becoming part of the story. But actually, you have people who know enough science, who have enough of an understanding that they're able to sort of be interested and kind of have this impulse to try to solve things themselves in new ways. And this all fosters alternative knowledge coming into the fore. Um, And of course, the Siberian landscape where it occurs and the fact that it continued to be mysterious is important as well. Um, Now, this begins, of course, with this fiction writer, Alexander Kazantsev, who in late 1945 writes and then early 1946 publishes a short story in the journal around the world called Explosion, a Story Hypothesis. Now, this is a fictional piece, right? This is like a very typical science fiction or what they call scientific fantasy piece where you have these two scientists, they have different ideas about different mysteries, and they go out and try to solve them. And then at the very end of the story, it comes up with this hypothesis that the explosion of Tunguska was a nuclear explosion that occurred above ground when an alien spaceship exploded over the Siberian taiga, right? And this is, of course, initially posed as a fictional idea, right? Um, as soon as April 1st, 1946, the New York Times has gotten wind of this and presents it as not necessarily fiction, as this idea that somehow there was a the Soviets are saying somehow there might have been a nuclear explosion in 1908. Kazantsev himself, whether he fully believed his idea when he wrote the story or not, comes to want to promote it. And he puts on this show at the Moscow Planetarium that gives voice to this idea that the Tunguska explosion of 1908 was caused by the explosion of an atomically powered alien spacecraft. And a lot of people are exposed to it. It becomes a whole controversy. Just to go back to this slide for a second, the efforts of the mainstream meteorite scientists to refute this idea ends up spreading it further. They published this thing in the national paper Literaturная Gazeta saying, "Oh no, it's clearly not a Martian ship. It was a meteorite," and that's where a lot of people first learned that it might have been a Martian ship. Um, this whole idea then kind of takes on a life of its own, and Tunguska plays this really important role in the rise of Soviet ufology in slightly later, both in terms of it as a flashpoint for thinking about how there might have been extraterrestrial contact in the past, and then also very personally, this one of the major figures in Soviet UFO studies, this guy Felix Ziegel, he is this guy standing here, one of these guys standing here at the planetarium show that was part of Kazantsev's planetarium show in the 1940s. Um, this spawns all sorts of other theories, right, as well. So variations on what might have caused Tunguska start to emerge. Variations on whether these were interplanetary or intergalactic aliens, whether something like a plasmonoid could have been responsible, what aliens might have been doing, whether it was intentional. All sorts of other new explanations kind of come to the fore, things like antimatter and a miniature black hole and these types of things. It also these sort of ideas also sponsor help give rise to all sorts of Tunguska fiction. Everything from Stanislav Lem, who writes one of his first books, The Astronauts, refers to Tunguska, to Boris Anakadis Strugatsky, Thomas Pidgeon from the West, and Vladimir Sorokin, a more contemporary writer, all sort of end up having the Tunguska event as this sort of Russian Roswell flashpoint. Oh, I forgot, amongst the other wilder explanations is this notion that comes out in the 1980s that Tunguska might have been caused by Nikola Tesla experimenting with his death ray in Manhattan and trying to send a signal to the North Pole, to Robert Peary on the North Pole and missing, and instead hitting the Siberian taiga. Um, okay, so that's, we have all these wild ideas that are out there. But it gets even more interesting in some ways because what happens in the late 1950s is this entire cohort of sort of post-war Soviet youth take up the mantle of trying to understand whether Kazantsev was right. And they start to undertake their own voluntary expeditions to the Tunguska site to see if there was a UFO there. And the main group is this group called the Complex Amateur Expedition, or KSE, um, that originates out of Tomsk and essentially undertakes its own efforts starting in the late 1950s. But you also have other groups such as this one guy, Zolotov, who somehow has his own funding. You have a group that's sent that includes a cosmonaut, Grigory Grechko, that's sent by Sergei Korolev, the sort of brains behind the Soviet space program, to go see if there's an alien spaceship there. You have all of these sort of amateur initiatives that are all coinciding initially with a renewed effort of the Soviet Academy of Sciences Committee on Meteorites to investigate the site. Um, and it's a very interesting in terms of the ways that these expeditions emerge. I mean, there's competition and their relationship with the mainstream meteorite scientists at the Soviet Academy of Scientists. First, they don't like each other at all. They're fighting. Then they end up collaborating. They have a combined expedition in 61 to the Tunguska site with the voluntary and the official meteorite scientists. And then they sort of overtake it. So this endeavor of these voluntary researchers start going to the site every year from the late 1950s into the early 2000s, almost every year, to investigate what might have happened and whether it might have been a nuclear explosion. Um, this is also where we see this sort of various and very interesting types of Soviet collectivity emerge, while all of these folks seem to want, not all, but many of them seem to want to be the one to figure out the mystery, be the Sherlock Holmes, be the one who solves it all. And these pictures here, just to very quickly, two of these individuals up on the top there, that's from the 1959 expedition that include Valery Kushnikov and Gennady Plekhanov, who I got to meet in Tomsk in 2018 when Plekhanov was in his 90s at that point. Both of them have since passed, but they were part of this initial expeditions and went out, spent, many, many years investigating this. Plekhanov ended up deciding that it must have actually just been a meteorite, whereas Kushnikov told me right there that he still thought that Kazantsev was correct and that it was aliens involved with the Tunguska event. Now, as these volunteers get involved, they bring in all sorts of new and varied approaches to mystery solving. First off, they're focused on trying to find evidence of a nuclear explosion. So they measure radioactivity, they chart the tree fall at the place, they take peat and soil samples, they look for microspherules, they start using computer modeling. Some of this is not just for trying to find evidence of the nuclear explosion, because they actually bring a very much like, we're trying to figure it out, right? We will think, a lot of them think that it must be aliens, but they try to be like, we're trying to determine between these two hypotheses, right? They're very much engaged in empirical research, very earnestly. They look for genetic anomalies, thermoluminescence, geomagnetic anomalies, and other things. And they believe in their heart of hearts that the landscape is going to be the thing that helps solve the mystery. The forest, as Andrei Zolotov, one of the proponents of Kazantsev nuclear explanation, said, the forest will not be silent. It is the main witness of the catastrophe. Therefore, precisely it, whether perished, preserved, or regrown, will help solve the mystery. So very sort of interesting, effective relationship to the landscape itself. Now, all the while that this is going on, two things. One, I should actually mention that they're part of the boon of this whole voluntary expedition is that they do find immediately heightened radioactivity at the site. This turns out to be a combination of two things. First off, this landscape is on what's called the Siberian Traps, which has a sort of different radioactive profile deep underground than other parts of the Siberian taiga. And this is the early 60s, which was the height of radioactive fallout worldwide as atomic weapons were being tested. So both of those things ended up interfering with their readings. Like the readings were true, but like upon further investigation, there was no evidence that this site itself had a radioactive profile that suggested a nuclear detonation in 1908. Okay, so all that's happening, and in the meantime, the mainstream scientists who have been investigating the Tunguska explosion decide that it wasn't a meteorite after all. It was a comet. It was not a sort of rocky chunk of asteroid or a metallic chunk of an asteroid, but a icy, what was used to be called a dirty snowball that exploded above ground. And this was important. They felt that a comet would make sense if for exploding above ground, and that could sort of explain why there wasn't remnants and why there wasn't a crater. And this becomes sort of the mainstream idea. They even apply for prizes and say, hey, we solved the Tunguska mystery. It was a comet. Okay. That turns out not to be right. And that's why I think an important part of the story is that while the mainstream atmospheric scientists are saying we have this solved, their idea ends up being premature. Now, I have a whole chapter, of course, that looks more at these voluntary expeditions, not just in terms of what they did and what their science was, but as a cultural phenomenon. Because we're talking about hundreds of people who went out, sometimes multiple summers in a row, and spent more than a month in the Siberian taiga in the 1960s to 1980s and beyond. And they developed their own distinctive subculture with interesting art and literature, poems. They almost all wrote poems, specific routines, romances, conflicts, betrayals, um, and engagements with the natural world, the environment of Siberia, that affected them very deeply in their memories of youth. Um, uh, they they've left a lot of materials for us to look at, which is actually a wonderful part of this project. But they, constantly talked about how pesty the mosquitoes and horseflies were at the site. They noted the behavior of dogs they would bring along with them. Was this one guy who they talked about is this like chipmunk lover who kind of managed to almost tame some chipmunks. They hunted bears occasionally. They had many campfires where they would sing songs, certain provisions. They produced their own almanac, this thing called the Kurumnik, which had all sorts of humor in it and all sorts of poking fun of each other, poking fun of the world, poking fun of the Soviet Union in some ways, poking fun of all sorts of things. They appropriated Evenki culture. They made Agdi, who was an Evenki spirit, who was, according to some of the earlier accounts, behind the Tunguska explosion and Evenki understandings of the event. They appropriated him as the god of the taiga, the god of Tunguska, and they carved Agdi into trees. And it was very much a sort of cultural appropriation of Evenki ideas while they were excluding the Venki from actually participating in these expeditions, and sort of having a more working with the hosting community that had come to emerge in the nearby town of Bonnevaro. You see instances in this in their culture of the ways that class in the Soviet Union ends up being very reflected through education and culture. Sort of tensions between some of the less educated locals who were helping these expeditions and these mostly students and professors who were out in the taiga. You also see really interesting relationships of gender. And so one thing that I had expected when I first kind of heard about this was that it would be mostly men. But actually it ends up being a lot of women who end up coming and participating in these expeditions. And some of them find this to be like, this was where I really felt free. This is where there was really an egalitarianism, gender egalitarianism. This was this wonderful experience. Others felt that there were, a lot of creepy men around, and there's all sorts of, um, you know, uh, mention of not poor behavior, but sort of just, romances and scandals and breakups and potentially lecherous individuals. Um, a lot of the people who did these expeditions were Communist Party members. And that gives a very interesting way that they handled things. They sort of often kind of told the KGB they were going to go out and do this and didn't ask for permission, but just did it. Some of the people who were involved become sort of dissidents and aligned with it, and then they ends up being these tensions amongst these old friends, and especially the ones in Tomsk who stopped talking to each other after having spent, every summer in the Tunguska taiga together for years. Um, and there are then of course some others who end up sort of emphasizing their dissidence perhaps more than they did at the time. At one point in the 1980s, the KGB declares the complex amateur expedition a potentially harmful anti-Soviet organization, even though it had um, supported it through much of the period, and many of its leaders were ardent party members. Um, Another element of this story is this very distinctive way that nature protection came to exist in this place. It became another part of the mystery solving repertoire where there was a campaign, a successful campaign to turn this into the site of the Tunguska blast into a nature reserve. And it involved a very different rationale. This wasn't, oh, this is such a beautiful landscape or it's so valuable or something, there was some battle here or something like that, or it's the Grand Canyon. It was because of this notion that was a landscape of cosmic connection and a landscape of mystery. And that was the thing that sort of tied together actually the people who had very different ideas about what caused Tunguska and fought each other in all sorts of ways. So these folks down here, Felix Zeigel and Victor Zhuravlov, end up collaborating with mainstream thinkers about the Tunguska site. Um, and they were also became extremely worried in the 1980s when it seemed like there was geological prospecting that might end up causing industrial encroachment upon the site. And they really rapidly put together, and it was these voluntary expeditionists who wanted to solve the Tunguska mystery, who led to the creation of a nature reserve, a Zapovednik, in 1995 after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Um, it's a very their own ecological environmental list ideas are very distinctive and interesting. It's sort of a combination of a sort of Soviet humanism with a conservative Clash of Civilizations pessimism. They're very influenced by this thinker, end up being very influenced by this thinker Lev Gumilov, who was kind of an outcast in the Soviet period, but then becomes very popular in post-Soviet Russia, while also sort of aligning those types of ideas with their Communist Party membership. So I call it a sort of conservative communist party idea of conservation, and it's a very just sort of amalgam of different ideas that sees the Soviet system as rational and superior, but also sort of sees technology as this sort of unescapable force that is either going to be controlled by moral evolution, by people more evolving morally and becoming better people, or we're gonna all die in a collapse of civilizations. Um, Not surprisingly, just in terms of the history of conservation, um, when the people were advocating for a nature reserve, they were not necessarily thinking first and foremost about the Evenki, whose land was this was their homeland. They had lived there well before any Russians were there nearby. Um, but they did end up putting an Evenki man as the sort of first director of the nature reserve, which is very fitting with sort of nationality policies in the region. Um, and of course, another sort of really interesting part of this is the protective regime that then emerges when the site is turned into a nature reserve, ends up making it more difficult for the voluntary researchers to continue their research. It actually complicates the matter when it's a preserved territory for the groups that had been coming out every year to sort, check for radioactivity and other signs of possible alien involvement. Now, I'm getting near then, but in the book, I then sort of step back and look again at how this event was understood throughout the world, and how uh, Tunguska investigations for those who were foreigners had their own sort of character of inadvertent collaboration, intentional collaboration, information lost in translation, unmoored conjecture. And there's also, it's interesting that several of the sort of ideas about Tunguska that are kind of on the wilder side emerged independently from abroad. So the idea that it was antimatter or a miniature black hole or Tesla's death ray all came from abroad. Even the idea that it was a comet that I'll talk about a little bit more um, appeared simultaneously both in the Soviet Union and abroad. Um, in the 1980s, so there was interest in the 1930s about having a British expedition to the Tunguska site, and the Soviets turned it down. So really, the next time that foreigners get to the Tunguska site is in the 1980s, when both researchers from Japan and from Italy start to want to investigate the site. Now, the Japan group is the first foreigners who actually get there. This is it's the Sakura group who believe that Tunguska might have been caused when um, and ancestors from an ancient civilization that existed in Japan that had been technologically advanced. They believe that their ancestors had gone into space and then were coming back and somehow had an accident over the Tunguska site. Just in terms of the theories that kind of emerged there. The Italians were more sort of robust empiricists and started doing annual expeditions as well. NASA was less interested. They do a little bit of sort of remote research, but they never fund their own expedition. A few NASA affiliated scientists get there in the 1990s, but not many. Um, and all the while in the 1990s, you're having this sort of flourishing of alternative theories about what could have caused Tunguska, like sort of the cat's out of the bag, even more so. And Tunguska's on the X-Files, Tunguska's, in comic books, it's in a Metallica music video. It's all over the place in terms of thinking about what wild possibilities might exist out there while our understanding of asteroids and the threat that they pose improve dramatically. So, starting in the 1980s, there becomes very good reason to think that it is perfectly possible for an asteroid to explode, a stony asteroid to explode in the sky. It doesn't need to be a comet. And frankly, we don't know of many comets that have ever been able to hit the Earth, so that becomes no real reason to think of it as a comet. Um, and this is uh, dramatically uh, shown in 2013 when there's a an asteroid that explodes over Chelyabinsk, also in Russia, that's recorded live. People have these dash cams that show it happening at the time. And they are able to collect material from the bolide that explodes very immediately. It demonstrates this possibility. So the mainstream view today, of course, is that Tunguska was caused by a medium-sized stony asteroid that exploded over Siberia. And that's why there was no crater. And the reason that there was no remnants is because by the time that it was investigated, it would have washed away into the landscape. Um, this becomes solidified enough that I believe it was 2015, the United Nations declares International Asteroid Day to be June 30th in commemoration of the Tunguska explosion, as a sort of more solidified understanding of what this was. I end the book by weighing in on the significance of this event for the contemporary world. I decide less to sort of revisit some of the historiographical interventions that it has, and more for sort of think about the world, because I think that there's a lot of environmental precarity that we are dealing with, and the fact that we've experienced a cosmic explosion has all sorts of interesting sort of implications for us. It's also the case that I tell this story about how the closest I actually ever got to the site of the Tunguska blast itself was that top picture there, which is the epicenter of the Tunguska blast, but it's taken from a helicopter. I was supposed to be able to sort of go to the site of all of these expeditions themselves, but there were forest fires going on that prevented that from happening. The next summer, there were even worse forest fires, such that this picture of this Evenki girl in a mask in the town of Annavara sort of circulated in international media. And of course, the year after that, we were all wearing masks because of COVID. Um, and it underscores the sort of precarity of climate change and increased forest fires in the world. And it made me also think about just what is the implications here of this sort of cosmic disaster? And it's the reverse of the sort of idea of trying to transcend the planet an escape in colonizing Mars and these sorts of ideas, and really to be like, wait, we have dealt with something as exotic as a cosmic collision in the past, and we have the tools to do so again in the future if we stay with it and embrace our planetary embeddedness. Um, Now, I do have a coda that has happened since the end of this book, and I just want to briefly talk about it for a second. So my whole approach here was to emphasize mystery. It was to think of mystery as a cultural production. It was to embrace what I called strategic agnosticism about the cause of the Tunguska blast, right? Like try to treat the ideas of the people who thought it was aliens as fairly as I could, as well as the people who claimed it was an asteroid. Um, and in terms of a methodology for historical investigation, I still think that is completely the appropriate uh, approach. One of the things I did though was I interviewed all sorts of people. I talked to tons of people in Russia. I also interviewed some American scientists who had written about Tunguska, and one of them, this guy Mark Boslow, um, eventually starts asking me questions, like over email after I had interviewed him about the history of Tunguska, and it's all sort of part of this effort that he has to um, push back against contemporary ideas that he thinks are nonsense, circulating about meteorites and asteroids. Um, and in particular, there were claims about the Tunguska explosion that were used to write this article that purported that a Tunguska-sized airburst might have happened over the middle-aged city of Tal Haman, or the destruction of Sodom was caused by an airburst explosion of an asteroid, in more colloquial terms. Um, and my own historical sleuthing on some of this was able to sort of help him put it together that eventually got this article retracted, which I feel very ambivalent about in terms of the sense that I started this project from the standpoint of strategic agnosticism, and then I end up playing this role of a debunker somewhat inadvertently and despite myself, though I still think that we were right. Okay, I'll stop there and we can chat a little bit about all of this. Let me stop share.